Hello and welcome to another edition of Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I have another fantastic guest with me this week, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys about this book. So would you like to introduce yourself and what we're going to be talking about this week?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I am so thrilled to be here. I am Chanel Cleeton and I write historical fiction. And my latest book, The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, just came out this week.
It's a beautiful book and a beautiful cover, and we were just talking about how gorgeous that white dress was when we were off camera here a moment ago. But I would love to have you set the scene a little bit and tell us a bit about what people can expect when they pick this book up.
Sure. So, The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba is set at the end of the 19th century during the Gilded Age. And it's the story of three women. One of the women is a true life figure. She was a revolutionary woman in Cuba. Her name's Evangelina Cisneros. And she was imprisoned by the Spanish in this sort of notorious women's prison in Havana called Recogidas. And her plight really came to the attention of the New York newspapers, and particularly William Randolph Hearst, who was the publisher of the New York Journal at the time. And he really saw an opportunity to use her and her story as sort of a rallying cry to get the United States involved in the conflict in Cuba and the fight for independence from Spain. And so her story sort of intersects with two other heroines. There's Grace, who is a journalist. She's in New York City, and she's sort of modeled after a Nellie Bly figure. She's someone who is really looking to make her mark in the New York newspaper scene and is kind of enmeshed in this cutthroat world of journalism at that time period. And when she comes across Evangelina's story, she becomes involved in these efforts to rescue her from this prison. And then the third heroine is someone who might be kind of recognizable, at least a recognizable last name to some of my other readers who've read my first historical fiction books. Her name is Marina Perez, and she is one of the Perez ancestors. So we're going back in time a little bit in the family's history from the books that I've previously written and kind of looking more at their origins. And she is a Cuban woman who is in Cuba at the time of the fight for independence from Spain. Her husband is fighting with revolutionaries, and she, her mother-in-law, and her daughter are sent to some of the reconcentration camps that the Spanish have set up in Cuba at the time. And so her story really is one of the struggle inside the country during this fight for independence. She gets involved with the revolutionary effort in her own way, working as a courier for some of the figures who are involved in those efforts, and starts spying. And that's how she sort of becomes involved with Evangelina's story as well.
It's so interesting because in this book you have three seemingly very disparate stories of three women who are in very different places, both geographically and in different places in their lives as well. And you really do sort of bring them all together in such an elegant way. It ties up really, really nicely. But I'd love a chance to sort of dive in with each of those women a little bit and talk a bit about sort of the inspiration and how you came to that particular part of the story. So I think perhaps we'll start with New York City first, if
Sure.
that sounds good to you,
Yes.
and Grace's story. So how did you come into deciding that this was the character that you wanted to write about?
So Grace's story really came from just how much of this story politically really was influenced by the New York papers. So the push to war, obviously we all know about the USS Maine, kind of learned about that in history class, and that was certainly kind of the nearer cause of the decision to go to war. But in the years leading up to that event, you really had this big movement in the newspaper industry, particularly championed by Hearst, to try to get the US involved. And so there really was kind of all this propaganda at the time. It played a huge role in Cuba's fortunes and then kind of the Cuban groups in the US who were sort of lobbying to get the US involved. So I knew that I wanted to focus on that part of the story. It was such an important part. And also specifically when talking about Evangelina, the newspapers played such an enormous role that I wanted to kind of give readers some insight on what that world was like. And the more I researched it, it was just such a fascinating time in journalism. I mean, you really had these sort of larger than life figures with William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and they were engaged in this bitter rivalry. I mean, they were spending ridiculous sums of money. Kind of anecdotally, they said if the Spanish-American War had continued on, they both would have probably bankrupted themselves. So there was just so much material there that was really fascinating and rich. And I really wanted to have the reader be in that world. and found Grace to be an opportunity for readers to see what it was like for women in the industry in that time, and also just to get a taste of the flavor of the journalism world in New York.
For me in particular, there was a lovely, tie to my personal history, because I'm an alumnus of Columbia University's journalism school, and that is a school that absolutely venerates Pulitzer. The Pulitzers were
Yes.
run out of there for very good reason. He provided the money to found the school. Our big sort of conference room there, or big auditorium, was called the World Room after the newspaper. And sometimes I think when you go to that school and you kind of are getting your degree in that myth making environment, you forget just how cutthroat things were on both sides. And so you have some corporate espionage, you have some, somewhat underhanded dealings on both Pulitzer and Hearst's part. And you have this character who's kind of caught up right in the middle of it, which is so interesting because it gives you a sense of what that environment really would have been like, and what those newsrooms, those really tough tabloid newsrooms, would have been like. I think it's an absolutely fascinating place to set a character's story in motion.
It really was. And, I'm sure it's often so difficult when you're working with real life, how much do you fictionalize, how much do you dramatize? And with this, I mean, really, I felt like the historical record was so dramatic that it hardly needed my embellishment. Just sort of their antics and the things that they did. So
Yeah. And then when you're coming to, as you said, there's very much real life in this story as well, because we have a whole storyline that follows a woman who is imprisoned. And how did you come across that story? How did that enter into this book?
So I had the idea to write the book before I knew about her life. I was down in the Florida Keys researching my previous release, which was The Last Train to Key West. And while I was there, just kind of out of interest, I visited the San Carlos Institute, which is a Cuban cultural heritage center in Key West, and also the USS Maine Memorial. And I grew up in a Cuban American household. My family came over from Cuba in '67. And so I really grew up on kind of their memories of Cuba and their stories of home. But I will confess, most of my knowledge of Cuban history was really dominated by the revolution and my family's experiences living under Castro. I wasn't as familiar kind of going farther back into Cuban history. And these are events that, my great grandparents would have lived through. So I was really curious about what it was like in Cuba. And as I started researching, that's when I came across Evangelina's name. And I think at first it was just kind of a mention in a piece of nonfiction I was reading, and I sort of jotted it down. And then going back, when I started looking up the details of her life, it was just so fascinating that I knew it was a story that I wanted to tell and that I wanted to incorporate her in the book. And that's what sort of shaped, so much of the narrative for me.
It's interesting that she wasn't the starting place, but she actually kind of came about when you already had this idea that you wanted to write about this time period. And kind of, I imagine you had some of the story there, but not all of the pieces, because she is so central to so much of what happens. It's
Mm-hmm.
interesting, I think, and maybe surprising to some people, that she was maybe a bit of a later addition in the process of developing this pitch in this book.
I think, I probably came across her story maybe 3 months in. I mean, when I sold it to my publisher, we had that part of it kind of already
Okay.
together. So I hadn't started writing or anything, but it was more just kind of in the evidence gathering. I tend to start with like a very small idea. I'm not a plotter. And so I just was, I had told my agent I want to write about this time period and this setting. And she was like, okay, find your hook then. What are we going to do with this? And that's where really finding her just gave so much shape to the story. And I think at the same time, she came across in a mention talking about journalism and how much it influenced this time period. So finding her kind of happened at the same time that I was reading about Hearst and Pulitzer and this rivalry. And so it was kind of a serendipitous moment where it all sort of came together.
Those are wonderful, wonderful moments, and even better when
Yes.
they happen before you start writing, as opposed to when you're
Yes.
well into the book and realize, oh no, I've done something and I now need to undo certain things in order to get this really key thing into
Mm-hmm.
this book. So absolutely. What about the third timeline, when we're talking about this wonderful connection to your previous novels in sort of a prequel fashion? Where did the idea for this character come from?
So that came from the record as well. And she actually came after I had kind of started crafting the idea with Evangelina and with Grace. And I emailed my editor. I was researching this time period, and just so much stuck out for me about what was going on in Cuba at the time. And, given my Cuban heritage, it was something that I was very interested in exploring, and that I think really moved me, because this was just such a difficult time in Cuba, and people went through so many just kind of horrific struggles, that I felt like it was a story I wanted to explore, and wanted to tell. And at the time, trying to do my mental math, I think When We Left Cuba had just come out a little bit earlier. Or no, actually it hadn't. I had just had Next Year in Havana come out. And so I was falling in love with this family, but readers hadn't really met them yet. And I wasn't sure, how, if they were going to be interested in seeing the continuation, but I definitely felt this connection to them, and wanted to keep exploring them and their history.
It's such a wonderful way to kind of revisit elements of a story without writing a direct sequel or a direct prequel, which I think sometimes can be a bit tricky. You want to make sure that you're drawing in new stories and new readers, but it's almost like a bit of a nod that if somebody's picking up the book brand new, they wouldn't necessarily realize. But if it's a reader who's coming back to this, it's just building onto that story in such a wonderful way.
Yes, I like for all of my books to stand alone. I mean, I definitely think that's important, but I love for readers who've read, the different books in the series to kind of be like, oh, I recognize this house, or I recognize this person. And I think it's always nice when you kind of have those little moments and connections in books.
Absolutely. One of the things I really wanted to get the chance to talk to you a little bit about is sort of the different ways that your characters all um, sort of defy societal expectations. And I have a couple of questions that I'd love to ask about this. But one of the things is all of these women in their own way are sort of defying what people expect sort of a woman to how a woman should act, how femininity is kind of put on display in this period of time. So can you talk a little bit about how you go about kind of unpicking those nuances with these characters?
Sure. I think that's something I really enjoy exploring in my fiction. It's certainly something I kind of keep coming back to. I typically look for examples in the historical record of women that were doing these things in history, and then kind of will either fictionalize the character somewhat, or in the case of Evangelina, obviously I followed her actual life. But with Grace, like I said, she talks about this in the book. She's really inspired by Nellie Bly, and I really kind of modeled her off of her character in terms of just a sense of a woman trying to make it in this, particularly cutthroat world. Of course, at this time, Nellie Bly is much more established, and Grace's character is sort of coming up in the world. But I definitely used that in terms of trying to understand the possibility of what she could do. There was also a really big kind of push for these stunt girl reporters at this time. So I explored the stunt journalism a little bit and looked at some of the kinds of stories that they would have been working on, and put Grace in some of those positions. So that was definitely an inspiration for her character. And then with Marina, it was really looking at kind of the extraordinary stories of the women who were involved in the fight for Cuban independence. There were women who were nurses, there were women who were traveling with the revolutionaries and were involved with the army, women who were working as couriers and spies, people who were fundraising and raising awareness in the United States, and exile groups. So just wanting to kind of show the representation of all of those women who were really living through a very transformative time, and were trying to find a place for themselves in society where they felt like they could realize their aspirations and gain perhaps more rights and position in society.
And I think it's so interesting seeing that contrasted also with class in this book, because in each of these cases you have, women who have had some degree of privilege, or in some cases incredible amounts of privilege, and they really have been placed in a different environment than you might expect for them, both physically and then also, of course, when it comes to where they sit in the class ladder as well.
Yes, I mean, I definitely think I like to kind of see my characters and put my characters in positions where they're challenged. I think that often in fiction, that's kind of where we find interesting moments of growth for characters. And so that is something I kind of keep, I think, sort of coming back to through different events in my books, just highlighting kind of that tension of how you grow from the things that come your way in life, and how that, causes you to change, or perhaps adapt or survive.
Yeah, it is interesting because it is really a book of survival, and these women surviving in different ways, in some ways quite literally, but also the idea of, how do you go out into the world and make your way in a world that is not um, excited about seeing women in the workplace. And even with this, these stunt girl reporters, um, they're still not fully accepted into the newsroom in the way that they would necessarily want to be. And I think Grace really feels that, and she comes up against that several times.
Hmm.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions about your characters, and I think it would be a good time to ask one of those. Arlene is wondering, do you have characters from your body of work that haunt you, and why do you suppose that is?
I talked a little bit about how I kind of keep revisiting this family, and I think that's something that, when introduced them in Next Year in Havana is probably my most personal book in the sense that I really wrote it, it's a fictional family, but I very much wrote from a perspective of me kind of understanding my Cuban American identity, some of the stories that my family told me and were kind of passed down to me, and growing up in a household that was so influenced by exile. So with those characters, I think I just really have a special connection with them just because it was such a personal book for me. And so I've sort of revisited the family and then sometimes the characters and some of my work, and that's something I really enjoy having the opportunity to do.
Yeah, it must be interesting both seeing kind of elements of your family pop up in fiction, obviously fictionalized. We're not talking
Mhm.
necessarily about direct to page accounts, but weaving that then with the historical side as well, and the research that you have to do for these books. I know people are always curious about what that research process looks like. So I think the most basic question is, how long does it take for you to sort of research and feel comfortable enough to write a book like this?
So I will say every book is definitely different. With Next Year in Havana, because it was so personal and I had grown up with kind of such a strong foundation from my family's stories and just kind of living so much of that experience, I really started writing and then sort of researched as I wrote when I came across things that I knew I needed to go into a little bit deeper. I wanted to understand a little bit better. But that book was just kind of a different process for me. When We Left Cuba was somewhat similar, where I kind of researched as I wrote. When I got to Last Train to Key West, I tried to do that, and that one's set in the 30s and hurricane, and I didn't know as much about the Florida Keys at that time going into the book. So I really realized that front loading the research was going to make an enormous difference.
Mhm.
And then with The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, I did front load the research. So I want to say I probably pretty much full time researched maybe for about 6 months before I started writing. And then even as I was writing, obviously, you know how it is, you kind of come across something where it sends you down a rabbit hole and you spend a day looking up, something you didn't anticipate spending a day looking up. So yeah, it was definitely just kind of having that strong foundation and copious notes and then kind of going as I needed to as well. I probably read, watched, and listened to, I want to say over 100 sources. So that was, each kind of aspect of the novel on its own probably could have been its own book. So it was quite a bit of research, just trying to shape all the different facets of the world. And then writing time wasn't too bad. I several months probably, just because I had done so much research that I had a pretty clear idea of, where we were going to go and how I wanted the story to progress.
It's interesting. I also find that, especially when it's a subject that's slightly off of what I would normally sort of have my basis, because when you write a few books around the same time period in the same place, and you start to be able to have a bit of a working memory, a bit,
Yes.
and you sort of know where your footing is. But when you're moving time periods, you're moving locations, you're doing things that are a little bit different, you really do, at least in my experience, you really do need that sort of basis. Otherwise you sit down and start to write, and it's sort of kind of an amorphous story that
Yes.
isn't grounded in in whatever it is that you're trying to to set at both time and place. So, and one of the things that I think is wonderful about this book is, you feel the heat or the cold or the bustle or the dirt of a prison, and so you have those atmospheric details that I assume can only come from research.
Well, thank you. No, it was really important for me to kind of immerse the reader as much as possible. And it is, I'm sure you have this too, where research just dictates so much of your story too, that it really is so helpful to me when I'm kind of plotting out how things are gonna go.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious about also, because this may or may not be a period of time that people are really familiar with, or maybe
Mhm.
they sort of read about it in school, but it's been a little bit of time. How do you weave those historical, not just historical details in terms of the world of your story, or sort of what a character would have worn or eaten, but the actual events of the time? Because we are talking about, a period of time and a conflict that's complicated, because
Mhm.
these things always are. So what's the balance that you try to strike with telling us and grounding us in that detail without making it feel necessarily like a history book?
Sure. No, I think that definitely is challenging. It's one of those things, I don't know that I really have a specific way I do it. It just kind of, I try to do what feels right and go from there. I think sometimes, you know, you need to kind of condense months or events into a sentence or a couple sentences to kind of move the reader on to whatever the next narrative point of the novel is. Sometimes, an event is actually the dramatic narrative point of the novel. And so, with the explosion of the USS Maine, for example, I wanted my readers to feel like they were on the ground seeing that happen and experiencing that. Whereas there were other points in history I might have just kind of, given a few lines because it wasn't necessarily essential to the story. So I think it's asking yourself, what is going to add texture to the story? What is going to bring the reader into the story and is important to the plot? And then what is sort of just tangential, and I know I need to impart this information so that
Mhm.
it's clear, but I don't need to kind of dwell on it too much. And I will admit too, sometimes, as a writer, I'll kind of find something that I love and find particularly interesting. And so, I'll go into more detail on that. And maybe some readers find it interesting, some don't, but you've spent so much time, doing the research and working with these worlds that I think you can't help kind of having some personal, interest in certain things and be like, oh, I found this cool fact, how can I work this into my book? And either it stays in after edits or it doesn't. But
True. Yeah. Some of those end up on the cutting room floor,
yes,
as
yes.
they say. But were there any things in particular with this book that surprised you when you went about researching and you thought, I really have to put that in because that's just so cool?
I think a lot of just the behaviors of the time period. I'm not too spoilery to say this, but I have a scene where Hearst is in the Spanish American War and he's on a yacht and there's showgirls on the yacht with him. And that's something he really did. He went down there and brought all of his friends and champagne and had a party, and there was fighting, right off the shore of the boat, and that was just kind of that was Hearst. And I felt like that was an important fact for readers to sort of understand his personality and how just kind of eccentric he was. And so things like that I definitely wanted to put in because I thought that they really give readers kind of a sense of the time period and just kind of the dramatic disparity between the excess of the Gilded Age and New York society and then what you had going on in Cuba, which was also, like I said, I didn't know as much about that history before I started writing this book. And certainly that was a big learning opportunity for me and also something I found very interesting and also very sobering.
And did you find it challenging to weave, because you're working with three different perspectives, and in some case you're sort of moving back and forth within one of those characters' perspectives as well. Um, so you have multiple perspectives and you're working with multiple timelines, and trying to bring this story together. Were there challenges where you thought, I've written myself into a corner here and I have to figure out, because this just won't work in terms of my timeline. I need people to be in this one place, or I need this thing to happen in order to move the story along?
I can't think of really specific instances where that happened, but overall, having three heroines definitely was kind of dictated by that concern because with Evangelina's character, she lived so much of her life sort of in infamy, and so much of her story was kind of used as propaganda and kind of twisted to suit other people's narratives, that I wanted to be faithful and accurate to her story and tell it as she would have wanted it to be told. But she was in Recogidas for a large part of, this part of her story. And at times she was cut off from any kind of, public communication. So she really was in some ways a limited POV character, that she just didn't have access to what was going on, perhaps outside of, her immediate circle. And I wanted readers to get that sense of all the different factors and all the different influences that were going in. So I knew I needed to have other characters who would kind of give that perspective. Same thing with Marina, with her being in the camps. She also kind of had a limited perspective because she wasn't able to interact as freely or have access to information. And so to kind of bring the perspective of all the Cuban groups in the US, all the exiles who were living outside of Cuba, who were involved with the junta and who were involved with this push to get support for the Cuban fight for independence, Grace really was an opportunity to kind of put a character into that world and to give readers that perspective, because it was such an important part of the lead up to the war. But I needed a character who could go to the meetings in New York and be there to kind of bring that perspective to the reader as well.
Yeah, it's a really clever way to sit there and say, okay, I know we need to impart information, we need to ground people, where in the conflict we are, what's happening in the US, what's happening in Cuba. And so this is a way to bring people in, because that's literally her job, is to be the observer and to, find out this information, and then of course impart it through being a news reporter. So it is a very convenient device. I think I'm going to remember that for the next time I have one of these books where I think I have no idea how I'm going to do this. I'd love to ask you a little bit about your writing process. And I know we talked a little bit about, or you mentioned that you don't necessarily think of yourself, at least in the research stages, as a plotter. You sort of start with a small idea and then build out from there. How do you approach writing a novel?
That is a great question, and it changes.
It's a hard question.
Book. No, it really does change with each book. I think it's just, I mentioned how my research process has kind of evolved and changed with each book that I've written. And for me, I really just kind of tackle the story as I feel like it needs to be addressed. And each one is a little different for me. I mean, I think the constants are that I work in Scrivener, so I find that to be really useful, particularly with writing historical fiction and doing different timelines and different narratives. I like that I can kind of move scenes around and that I can store all my research there. And so that's definitely something that I do with all of my books. I don't really plot a ton before I start writing. I'm pretty much a pantser, and my editor is really lovely, because I'll always kind of give her a very bare sketch of an idea, and she'll be like, great, run with it. She's really great about supporting that. But for me, the story really comes out in the research. It comes out in the historical record. It comes out in the characters, who I feel like are always kind of surprising me, and the choices they make and their decisions. And I really love kind of the mystery of writing historical fiction. I never know what I'm going to stumble across. I never know what direction a story is necessarily going to take me. And so I think the freshness of that really keeps it very interesting. And I enjoy that. I will say revisions are probably my favorite part of the writing process. So I'm a very big reviser. I love, I think the freedom just to kind of draft in the beginning and put your words on the page and have it be as kind of organic of an experience as you possibly can. And then when you're going through the revision process, that's when I really look at it with a critical eye, and, I kind of trim things and polish. And with that, I usually do a hard copy revision. So I'll print the book out and do it, pen to paper. I'll do a revision pass on my computer. I'll do a revision pass where I read it on an e-reader, just to get a sense of what, it looks like for the reader from that perspective. Because I feel like each time I get kind of fresh eyes on it. And so I'll often catch things that I hadn't caught before. But yeah, it's just really, each book's a little bit different, but I think that's what I love about this job is, it's never really stale, and every day is something kind of new that you're tackling and learning.
Well, you've actually preempted one of my questions, so maybe we can talk a little bit more about why it is that you find yourself drawn back to historical fiction over and over again, and you have this wonderful backlist of books, but there must be something that continues to interest you about it.
I think for me, it really started with Next Year in Havana. I didn't necessarily intend to write historical fiction. I wrote romance before I wrote that. Excuse me 1 second, sorry. Of course. I'm sorry, I've been talking about the book so much that I'm starting to Sorry about that. I'm like losing my voice a little bit. Sorry, one second.
No, not a problem. Well, this is
Sorry.
actually a good opportunity to really quickly say, if anybody has any questions, continue to keep dropping them into the comments. We have been getting some of them, and I'll be asking them here in a moment. But it's a good opportunity, especially if you've read any of Chanel's previous books or read this book, or you're anticipating this one, to get a chance to ask some behind the scenes things as well, which I know people are always excited to learn more about.
Thank you. Sorry, I have an emergency cough drop. Sorry about
No,
that.
not at all. This is the less glamorous side of being an author that people
Yes.
don't realize. You sit in a chair and you do a bunch of interviews, and you slowly feel your voice going after, several long days. And obviously you've been on your release cycle here.
Yes.
So lots of interviews, I'm sure.
Yes, and I always get sick. I don't know if you have this, but I always get sick when I have a release, and then you're talking, and yes, it's just kind of a
must be all the sort
storm.
of built up stress, and suddenly your body thinks, nope, time to get sick. And you think, if you could hold off for a little while longer.
Yes.
So, what was I? Let me think. What was I asking?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I have it. What sort of draws you back to historical fiction as you're continuing to write?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of came across it with Next Year in Havana. So for me, the impetus to write that story was really from a family story that my dad told me about a night before they left Cuba, where they buried a box in the backyard of all of their kind of valuables because they didn't know when they would come back. And I was so gripped by that conversation, and just, all that I had grown up with, that I came up with the idea to write the book. And at the time, I didn't know that meant I was going to write historical fiction. I just sort of pitched the idea to my agent and editor, and they were really supportive. And then after writing that book, I fell in love with Beatrice's character. And so I wrote When We Left Cuba, and then it just sort of, I found myself just really enjoying telling these character stories and learning so much more about my Cuban heritage and history. And I felt like, it was something where I could really have kind of a personal connection to the books I was writing. And I've really enjoyed that. So it's taken me on a little bit of an unexpected journey, but I love learning about the past. I love exploring stories of sort of ordinary people who are living in extraordinary times. And I think also, with my academic background, the political history definitely fascinates me. So that's something that I really enjoy kind of exploring in my novels.
I'm so curious about the personal connection, and people here obviously are as well, because we have a couple of questions about it. So I'd love to have you weigh in on these. So Lisa asks, what does your family think about your books? And do they provide feedback as you're writing or after you've finished a book? If you have a family like mine, they absolutely provide feedback. Most of the time it's very positive, but they're also very happy to point out typos. So.
No, my family's been really supportive and very proud. With Next Year in Havana, I was really fortunate that I could share the book with my father and my grandfather as sort of, they lived through these experiences. What was it like for them? And to sort of get their perspective and any insights. And it's definitely opened up some conversations in my family about, parts of their experiences that I didn't really hear about when I was a little girl or didn't even really know to ask about. And so I definitely feel like I've kind of gotten a greater understanding of what they went through. And, my grandmother's passed on and my grandfather's getting older now. And so having that kind of connection and having those memories sort of preserved has been really special and very important to me. And my family has been great about reading, my other books, and I get kind of really nice notes from everyone. So it's been nice.
Oh, lovely. It's always wonderful to hear when people's families are supportive of their careers, obviously, but also just supportive of the fact that presumably you do this because you enjoy it. And, it's wonderful to see that level of sort of understanding how important it is to you as well.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question from Arthur, who asks, when you write about a country or location close to your heart, does it make it easier or harder to shape the world that you're building?
I think we all sort of carry our own histories and things. And so, I definitely write about things from the perspective of the way I grew up. I mean, the fact that my family came here in exile and there's kind of that diaspora sense with things, that definitely influences my writing. And I feel like that certainly comes through. I think I have a constant curiosity with Cuba just because I've heard so much about it, and it was such an important part of my life growing up. And my grandparents always thought that they would return, and kind of on a daily basis we're just waiting for Fidel to pass on. And so it always was sort of like a member in our house,
Mhm.
in terms of that presence and how much they would kind of talk about it. They lived with us growing up, and so that was definitely I think that has stuck with me and definitely influenced the choices that I've made, and the way that I write about it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting it's a really interesting experience to be able to draw on. And again, maybe this particular book doesn't touch as directly on
Mhm.
that familial experience, but I can imagine there's still that connection, and still that acknowledgement in your background of you know sort of the elements of this story that feel so familiar.
Well, and I think the patriotism, the dedication to your homeland, and the cries for a free Cuba definitely resonated. Evangelina was asked sort of how she wanted to end her story, and she said, with the call "Viva Cuba Libre," which is the call for a free Cuba, and that's a call that resonates with exile circles now. I mean, we you were hearing that in 1897, 1898. You hear it now, and so I think that sort of sense of love of country and sacrifice and dedication definitely resonated, in both novels.
Yeah, you can really feel that come through, and
Mm,
it's wonderful to see on the page.
thank you.
I'm always very nosy and would love, as one author to another, to hear a little bit more about your sort of whether you have a daily writing schedule. I know you said everything changes from book to book, and that's been my experience as well. Some books, for me at least, want to be written at 11 p.m., and some books want to be written at 5 a.m., and I really, really wish that they wouldn't, and they would just
Sure.
figure out a consistent time. But do you have a sort of daily writing routine that you stick to, or are you a little bit more free flowing with your routine?
I would say I'm probably free flowing. As you know, I feel like I'm often kind of juggling. I'll release a book a year. So often I'm researching, drafting one book, editing another book, and then promoting a third book. So
Yes.
it's constantly kind of a juggling act of which book needs your immediate attention. If I get edits back from my editor and she needs them in 2 weeks, then obviously I stop what I'm working on to turn those back around. Or like right now, being on book tour, even virtually, my focus really is on that because it is difficult for me to kind of put writing in as well. But it really just depends. I mean, everything's very deadline driven. I find if I have a date that I need to meet, then that kind of helps keep me on a certain path. I don't really do like, I have to hit X word count a day or anything like
Mhm.
that. Some days are better than others. Some days aren't going well and they turn into research days or work on my newsletter days or, whatever I need to do. So really it's not like an elegant process, I wouldn't say,
No.
but it's just, do what you have to do to get the book in and make your deadline. I try to work somewhat normal hours, like business hours, during the day, but sometimes I'm working evenings, sometimes I'm working weekends. Sometimes I'm working mornings, evenings, weekends. It just depends on if you're behind, if what you need to do to get the book done. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that really what it boils down to, especially if you have a contract in your hand, and this is the thing
mhm.
that really changes, I think, from, or at least my experience was writing my first book. Great. I had sort of all the time in the world, and I
Mhm.
really I really wanted to get published, and it was really important to me, and I was so focused on that I sort of wish that I had taken the advice of a published author I'd spoken to before I had my first book contract, who said, enjoy this time for as long as you can, because the one thing about getting published is it means that now you have deadlines imposed on you. And again, I used to be a journalist, so deadlines felt very familiar, but there is something kind of wonderful about having as much scope as you want. Now, it can be a challenge too, and it can be difficult
Mhm.
to kind of focus down. But a deadline can be very motivating and very frustrating at the same time sometimes.
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely. Do you have any advice that you typically give to, aspiring authors who are looking at historical fiction as something that they might want to pursue themselves?
I think just kind of for anyone who wants to write, I think reading, as widely as you can, both in the genre you want to write in and, just other genres, is tremendously helpful. I think it gives you a sense of the expectations of the genre that you're writing in, but also I feel like I learned so much from other authors, and especially writing, reading outside of my genre. Fantasy is so great for world building, or suspense is so great for pacing. And so that's really helpful to me, to have kind of those moments. I think learning as much as you can about the industry is really helpful. One thing I was extremely fortunate to do kind of early in my career was I did a remote internship with a literary agency. And that was just a really good way for me to kind of learn about querying and, synopses and what it was like to kind of go through the publication process. And it was before I was agented or anything like that, but it just gave me really good insight. I think there's the craft part of writing, and then there's the business part of writing. And the more you can do to kind of immerse yourself in both worlds, I think it's really helpful. And also just, find what works for you. I think everyone is really different, and the way our brains work, the way our writing process works, and you kind of have to find your path, which might be different from someone else's. I'm not someone who does well with like writing workshops. I don't know why, but I can't like process the information. I just have a hard time. But like I mentioned, reading is really helpful for me. So I found that is a way that I kind of work on my craft. I think experience just helps a ton too. The more you write, the more comfortable you get with your voice and kind of learn what you want to say, and trusting yourself, I think is really helpful too.
I completely agree. I'm so curious about this remote internship, if you don't mind going back a little
Mhm.
bit. Was that
No.
something that you did specifically to learn more about the business, or did you have a particular interest in entering into maybe that side of the publishing world?
So it was a little bit of both. I was in law school at the time, and I hated law school.
You're not the
And
first person to tell me that.
no, it's not a good experience. So I didn't like law school, and I was like, okay, what can I do that's kind of adjacent to this, but not having to actually practice? And I knew literary agents do a lot with contracts. A lot of agents are former attorneys, and so, or are practicing attorneys. And so I thought, I was writing at the time. I had a manuscript that I'd been querying, and I had gotten a lot of rejections. I did not know what I was doing, if I'm being honest. And so I thought, this is one way that I can kind of see if this is a part of the industry I'd be interested in working at. And it's also an opportunity for me to kind of learn the business, because there was just so much, I didn't understand about publishing. I had been kind of a lifelong reader and lover of books, but I didn't quite know, the ins and outs of what a good query letter was. And it was also kind of, early internet, where you had a
Mm.
lot of those resources. Like it was before Twitter was such a big thing, and you could follow agents, and I was still kind of just learning things. So it was a great opportunity for me. And up until that point, there were just things that I had heard agents say, but I didn't understand. And then once you started reading a ton of queries and submissions, you started to kind of understand, that yes, you can often tell if you love a voice in a page, and things like that. So it was just really really helpful for me on lots of levels.
It's such a smart way to go about this business, that even with all of the resources that are now available online and a lot of people talking on Twitter, it's certainly better than it was, I think, from the sounds of it, when both of us were trying to,
Mm-hmm.
break into this industry. There's so much mystery shrouded in it,
Mm-hmm.
around it still. And I think, I was a few books into my writing career before I felt like I had a decent handle on all of the different elements that my publisher was going to ask me about, sort of assume that I knew without,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of assumption that the author knows what's going on. And the reality is the authors don't know what's going
Yes,
on.
yes, no, it's
When it
very
gets
true.
in, yeah, when it gets into sort of the editorial and then production and then marketing and promotion stages, it's a very, very different world than I think most people talk about openly. So that's such a smart way to go about learning more about it. And I can imagine being able to sort of see things, from that other side of
Mm-hmm.
the so-called aisle. When you're looking at it from a literary agency perspective, it must give you an insight also into what you think with a pitch might be particularly desirable for booksellers, or what
Mm-hmm.
marketing might be able to go out with. So I imagine that's been hugely helpful.
It was wonderful. I mean, I think one of the challenges, and who knows now with how much is changing, if we're going to see more remote opportunities, that was definitely something that I, as interested as I was in it at the time, you really had to be in New York, and that wasn't an
Yeah.
option for me. So that kind of changed things. I was lucky there were a few remote internships, and I happened to find one that was remote. And being in law school, I had the opportunity to do it. I just kind of read in like the evenings and weekends and when I could find free time, because you do read a lot of submissions for them. But it was incredibly helpful. And, I hope going forward we see kind of a push to more remote work within publishing, because I think for a lot of people, that need to be in New York is a barrier on a lot of levels. So hopefully, we'll see some more opportunities open up. And I think for me too, a lot of people I don't know necessarily realize this, but when I started writing historical fiction, I had written 10 romances and published 10 romances. So that definitely helped. I wasn't coming into historical fiction not having, kind of experienced some of the things of a life cycle of a book, which definitely, I think helped with Next Year in Havana.
Yeah, absolutely. I also came from the world of having written romances, both historical and then contemporary as well, and some novellas. And I think it really does help having at least a little bit of it's a different genre, but a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
a familiarity with sort of what the process is going to be like,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you're launching books with, as we were talking about earlier, both hardcover and paperback releases, and it's a bit of a different animal than the romance world, but there's a lot of crossover, which is really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find, or have you found that your background as a romance author has helped with your historical fiction books? This is a question I get a lot. So again, I'm being nosy and curious to hear your side of things.
I think it's been really helpful. When I wrote romance, I was doing 3 books a year, which by romance standards is not prolific at all. Romance writers are amazing at how many books they're able to publish a year. But I think for me, it helped me get on kind of a disciplined publication schedule, so that I knew kind of what I needed to do to get the book out in time, and also to write pretty quickly. I think also just in terms of characterization and kind of those emotional connections between characters, I think that background has been really helpful. And, often I'll find, if I'm being totally honest, when I'm stuck or, I'm a little bit not sure where the story is going, that's always a part of the story that I can pick up, and I'm very happy to do so. And, if I'm having a bad writing day, sometimes I'll play with the relationship on a character. I don't write linearly. I jump around with scenes. So, that's always kind of a fun thing for me to come back to, and to be able to explore those connections in my books. My historical fiction books all have kind of love stories. They aren't, the genre definition of romance, but they all have romantic relationships and stories between the characters. And so I love kind of exploring those emotions and just that kind of character development.
I think it's a natural area to want to explore in any book because it's such a large part of so many people's lives, and I think people are naturally drawn to romance and literature. And even better, if you can pull in that previous experience of character development and sort of using a relationship as a way to move forward character motivation or even plot sometimes, and having that be this element, this tool that you have in your back pocket. We have a couple of questions, or
Okay.
a question and a response, Shelley, a very enthusiastic response from Carol. Are there plans for any of your books to become movies or limited run TV series? And we have some people echoing that this would be a great, great idea.
So I will say, I obviously it's hard because I can't say too much, but there are things kind of in the works with Havana. The road to movie and TV is definitely long, and kind of how we were talking about, publishing is this whole world that you learn. The TV movie world is this whole other world.
Of
And there's
course.
so much about it that is, kind of confusing and different. And so we'll see. It's always a fingers crossed. But there are things sort of in the works, but obviously no guarantees or anything yet. So
Well, we'll think good thoughts and
thank
keep hope up.
you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
wonderful. I'd love to hear a little bit about what you've been reading and enjoying recently. Any books that come to mind?
I've read some amazing historical fiction lately. I've read a few arcs that are coming out. Kaya Alderson's Sisters in Arms was phenomenal. I read that, and it is coming out, I believe, in the summer.
I
It's
think
a
it's a
World War II.
July release. Yeah.
Think so. Something, it's July or August, I think, but yes, it's World War II, and that's phenomenal. So that's Sisters in Arms by Kaya Alderson, and then I also read Vanessa Riley's Island Queen, which is also amazing, and I really recommend that one. I think that's a summer release as well. And then Natasha Lester's The Riviera House was also really, really incredible, and I think that one's like August, September maybe. So all of those I highly recommend.
Oh, wonderful. These are all books that are on my list as well. So I'm going to see if I can sneak in an early copy here or there. But no, it's been an incredible year for historical fiction, and I think we're seeing that in sort of readers responding really well to books that have been coming out, and of course yours as well. We've got a lot of people who are currently reading it, or have it on order and are excited to have the book come through. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. And I really appreciate you taking the time during a very busy, I'm sure, a very, very busy
Oh
week.
no, this was lovely. I really appreciate you having me, and thank you so much.
Absolutely. Can I ask really quickly that you let us know where people can find you on the internet? So if they want to find out a little bit more about your books or want to sign up for a newsletter, they can go ahead and do that.
Sure. So my website is chanelcleeton.com, and then I am on Instagram at Chanel Cleeton and Facebook, author Chanel Cleeton.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.